Mr. President, it's my understanding that the business before the Senate, what is the business before the Senate?
The Senate is considering H.R. 2029.
Which is?
McCAIN VA appropriations bill.
So we are now considering the McCAIN VA appropriations bill. Obviously, anything we do for our veterans is something that's laudable to all of us. But earlier, a very interesting vote took place here in the United States Senate when the Department of Defense appropriations bill, which funds the appropriations for the Department of Defense for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2016 for other purposes, etc. In other words, the Defense Appropriations Bill, which provides for the training, the equipment, the pay, the medical care, all of those vital necessities for the men and women who are serving in the military. A sufficient number of my colleagues, I believe all but one on the other side of the aisle, decided to vote against moving to that legislation. I want the record to be clear. A majority, all but one, of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as I understand it, voted against moving to the legislation which provides the funding for the defense of this nation and the men and women who serve it. Items that are vitally important to the men and women who are serving. Items like military personnel. Committee recommends $3 billion for pay, allowances, and other personnel costs for active reserve and guard troops activated for duty in Afghanistan and other contingencies. Counterterrorism partnership funds. Money provision that recommends $300 million for the Ukrainians who are now being dismantled by Vladimir Putin. Committee, as I mentioned, recommends money for pay, allowances, and other personnel costs for active reserve and guard troops activated for duty in Afghanistan and other contingency operations. The recommendation includes funding for subsistence, permanent change of station, travel, and special pays, including imminent danger pay, family separation allowance, and hardship duty pay. I'll have some other selections, but I think the American people ought to know what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle just voted against. Voted against paying allowances and personnel costs for the active reserve and guard troops activated for duty in Afghanistan. Include funding for subsistence, permanent change of station, travel, special pays, including imminent danger pay. The men and women who are serving in the military in imminent danger, we won't fund them. We decided not to fund them. Amazing, truly amazing. Counterterrorism Partnership Fund. There is item after item that is for the men and women. Appropriations for the men and women, their pay, their benefits, their weapons, their means to carry out their duties in dangerous times. Another program that's in here is Countering Violent Extremism Online. Another one is the European Reassurance Initiative. As I mentioned, Ukraine, counterterrorism. All of these provisions are contained in probably what is the most important obligation we have. I don't know of a greater obligation that we have to the American people and the security of the nation. And if there's any doubt about what's going on in the world, one might just notice what happened in the last couple of days with the loss of a Russian airliner under very suspicious circumstances. The continued pouring of weapons and capabilities into Syria by the Russians and Iranians, the continued gains made by ISIS in many parts of the world, including even as far away as parts of Africa and Afghanistan. Does anyone here, any of my colleagues, know of the strategy that the United States has to address these issues? They can't, because there is none. But here we are doing our duty, our constitutional obligation to provide for the men and women who are serving this nation and defend it, and for obscure reasons. Perhaps the Democrats, my colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle, will come to the floor and explain why. Explain why they would not go to a piece of legislation that protects this nation and the men and women who serve it. Now, I'm sure that in about 6 days, I believe it is, November 11th on Veterans Day, every one of my colleagues, like me, will go and be part of the celebration of the service and sacrifice of the men who have served. What have you got to say about the men and women who are now serving? What you just did is you voted not to fund, train, equip, and defend these men and women, and without this, their lives are in greater danger. So don't go back and say that you're doing everything you can to defend this nation. You are not. You know, right now we have a very turbulent political situation in America. We have people who are now leading in the polls who perhaps have never held for public office. The approval rating of Congress is at 12% or lower. And sometimes I hear some of my colleagues wonder why we're held in such low esteem. If we can't even fund the men and women in the military and take care of their needs, who in the world will we take care of? So I believe that the Republican leader voted in a way that we can reconsider the vote. We need to reconsider the vote, Mr. President. We need to vote, and we need to be on record that we have done our barest of duties, our fundamental duty as elected officials, and that is the security of this nation. Right now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who voted not to move forward with this legislation have a lot of explaining to do. A lot of explaining to do on Veterans Day. A lot of explaining as to why they wouldn't take up the legislation that takes care of their change of station, takes care of their pay, takes care of their benefits, takes care of their health care. It's all in this legislation. And yet, my colleagues, for reasons which I do not understand, I say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, where are your priorities? Where are they? Is it to somehow gridlock that you want a certain piece of legislation brought up and not this one, or some other obscure reason? Or is it because you don't give a damn? Mr. President, this is an embarrassing time for me in this body when we have people, a large number of them, enough to prevent us from taking up what our barest minimal requirements of our obligations are to provide for the defense of this nation and the men and women who serve it. It's foolish, it's cynical, and dangerous to hold defense legislation hostage until every one of their political demands is met simply because of it. Veterans Day is 1 week away. I urge my Democratic colleagues, stop treating our national defense as a tool for extracting political leverage. Let's return to the bipartisan tradition of providing for the common defense. That's what the men and women serving in the military deserve and require from us. It's what the Americans expect of us, and it's what the Constitution demands of us.